Greetings, friends of liberty. All of us realize that sometimes those around us act inconsistently compared to what they say. And were we to search for the extremes of such inconsistency, probably no greater multiplicity of examples might be found than amongst the supreme pontiffs of the so-called Universal Church, that army of Pontifex Maximuses. Shall we briefly, for our edification, examine some of their more egregious instances of inconsistency, to see if they, in their self-righteousness, truly comport themselves as the vicars of Christ? Firstly, the Holy Scriptures say, "Thou shalt not kill," but the number of popes who have been murdered or responsible for murdering either directly or indirectly is extraordinary. Do they not believe their own good book? Amongst these direct murderers, we have John the 12th, Benedict the 9th, and Martin the 5th. But more importantly is indirect culpability. So Clement the 7th, for example, ordered the massacre of thousands of macaronis in the Italian town of Cesena. Similarly, every pope of more than 80 who approved of the use of the offices of the Holy Inquisition in many countries of Europe for the 5 centuries or more it has tortured and murdered, was culpable for those tens of thousands of innocents. Secondly, one might have thought that the evils of slavery, amongst the most harmful in human history, would have been opposed by the popes, but no, not a single one has yet explicitly condemned slavery. Not one of those paragons of virtue. In fact, the Venerable Bede reports that Gregory the Great, walking through the slave markets of Rome, found nothing unusual at all in the fact that boys from the British Isles were being sold as slaves. Gregory commented instead on how angelic they looked, with their fair skin and blonde hair. Similarly, Pope Leo I, as did many other popes, had not the slightest problem in enslaving those pagans who refused to convert to his outlandish Catholic dogma. Now, if we turn to the issue of the self-righteousness of the religious and others, in your own 21st century in the West, we find today Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, our social psychologist and moralist reporting the results of his decades-long research on the history and nature of human morality. According to him, morality binds and blinds in all cases. As Haidt says, human nature is not just intrinsically moral, it's also intrinsically moralistic, critical, and judgmental. Haidt begins by showing us his sense of humor, saying, people who devote their lives to studying something often come to believe that the object of their fascination is the key to understanding everything. Books have been published in recent years on the transformative role in human history played by cooking, mothering, war, even salt. This is one of those books. In his part 1 of 3, Haidt presents his argument that intuitions come first, strategic reasoning second. Moral intuitions arise automatically and almost instantaneously long before moral reasoning has a chance to get started, and those first intuitions tend to drive our later reasoning. Haidt uses the analogy of a rider on an elephant, our reasoning mind being the rider, and our moral feelings the elephant. And not only that, but he claims that the rider's job is to serve the elephant, this very distinct from the real world where the opposite occurs. Elephants serving the riders 99% of the time. In order to show us where his theory fits into the theories in his discipline of moral psychology, he reviews some of its most famous thinkers and concepts, discussing, number 1, Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget, who believed that children gradually, when their minds are ready, develop their own theories, usually correct, about right and wrong. This is called psychological rationalism. Haidt says, in this book, I'll use the word rationalist to describe anyone who believes that reasoning is the most important and reliable way to obtain moral knowledge. Number 2, American psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg, who developed a way to quantify Piaget's observation that children's moral reasoning changed over time, and who used his research to build a scientific justification for a secular, liberal, moral order. Number 3, UC Berkeley researcher Elliot Turiel, who argued that, apparently contrary to Piaget and Kohlberg, children apparently understand that some rules are more important than others. Number 4, how he himself was led to ponder, if Turiel was right that morality is really about harm, then why do most non-Western cultures moralize so many practices that seem to have nothing to do with harm? Because they're wrong? Examples apparently being disgust at menstruation, certain types of food, and sex. Haidt argues that his own research confirms that lower-class people in different countries, like Brazil and the US, are more moralistic and judgmental than upper-class people when it comes to conventional moral violations, like not wearing a school uniform to school. But again, there's no reason to think that lower class attitude genetically derived. Number 5. Haidt next mentions that Harvard sociobiologist Edward O. Wilson and the shameful treatment by the Harvard community. But this was not unexpected given Harvard's liberal bias. Haidt appears to agree with Wilson, saying that it seemed clear to Wilson that what the rationalists were really doing was generating clever justifications for moral intuitions that were best explained by evolution. Number 6. He discusses the theories of psychologist Howard Margolis, who reinforced his own idea that moral intuition, the so-called elephant, drives the process of moral judgment, saying, once I stopped thinking about emotion versus cognition and started thinking about intuition versus reasoning, everything fell into place. Number 7. He claims Dale Carnegie was one of the greatest elephant whisperers of all time. In his classic book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Carnegie repeatedly urged readers to avoid direct confrontations. Instead, he advised people to begin in a friendly way, to smile, to be a good listener, and to never say you're wrong. I can guarantee you, Jonathan, that won't work with me. Number 8. All of a sudden, to a degree, he significantly qualifies everything previously said, saying, elephants are sometimes open to reason. When Hume said that reason is the slave of the passions, I think he went too far. In addition, he says it is possible for people simply to reason their way to a moral conclusion that contradicts their initial intuitive judgment, although I believe this process is rare. He makes it sound as rare as the ivory-billed woodpecker. He adds later, I'm not saying we should all stop reasoning and go with our gut feelings. Gut feelings are sometimes better guides than reasoning, but they are often disastrous as a basis for public policy, science, and law. Number 9, finally, to wrap up his part 1, he claims that our in-house press secretary automatically justifies everything. This is quite clearly and obviously false, a typical example being people with a guilty conscience, endemically, or low self-esteem, who consistently run themselves down and make themselves look worse than they are. Some people are good salesmen of themselves, others bad. So having seen the intellectual influences on the formation of his own theories and some of his conclusions, let's now turn to his part 2. Here he starts by claiming that people in the West are weird, which is actually an acronym standing for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Of course, that's actually the opposite of weird. It means actually that we kick ass. Here again, he, not surprisingly, knocks Western rationality and individuality by implying that the more Western you are, the more you see a world full of separate objects rather than relationships. What this means socially is that Westerners are more individualistic. They see the individuals that make up a group rather than the group itself. In other words, they are not as collectivist. He next gives us brief biographies of important moral philosophers in the West, such as Jeremy Bentham with his utilitarianism of the greatest good for the greatest number, J.S. Mill and his broadly classically liberal outlook, and Immanuel Kant with his emphasis on duty. Subsequently, he turns to the main purpose of Part 2, which is to first explain what he regards as the evolutionary bases for different aspects of morality, saying, morality is like taste in many ways, 5 good candidates being care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. Summing these up, and his ideas how they arose through evolution, not moral reasoning, he says regarding care that this foundation evolved in response to the challenge of caring for vulnerable children. Regarding fairness, it allegedly evolved in response to the challenge of reaping the rewards of cooperation. Loyalty allegedly evolved in response to the challenge of forming and maintaining coalitions. Authority evolved in response to the challenge of forging relationships that will benefit us within social hierarchies. And finally, sanctity allegedly evolved initially in response to the challenge of the omnivore's dilemma, and then to the broader challenge of living in a world of pathogens and parasites. Note again, he's not just saying that these are potentially good ethical traits to have, but that they're encoded in our genes, and to some degree do not come from any rational understanding of what's good for us and our happiness. Next, let's turn to his Part 3. Here, his own ethical beliefs finally come to the fore, he clearly seeming to believe that altruism is good and selfishness, as he defines it, bad. One alleged example of altruism he was acquainted with personally was when 45 unrelated college students worked together cooperatively and for no pay to prepare for the opening night of Romeo and Juliet. Since he believes in the virtue of selflessness, he talks about potential ways that people can get into hive mode, singing in choruses, performing in marching bands, listening to sermons, attending political rallies, and meditating. He doesn't seem to realize that none of these need be altruistic in the slightest. For him, explaining cooperative behavior apparently involves both genes and cultural knowledge working together. Gene culture co-evolution gave us a set of tribal instincts, he claims. But he presents no actual confirming evidence, although citing the fact that a study done with foxes in Siberia and another done with laying hens shows how very rapid evolutionary changes can be in these species. But again, he presents no human proof. He further hypothesizes that if the hive switch is real, then it must be made out of neurons, neurotransmitters, and hormones. Of course, the irony is that animals also can be said to get animal culture, if only inadvertently. So if, for example, a monkey accidentally discovers that washing his food cleans it, and other monkeys do the monkey see, monkey do, then the group of monkeys can be said to pass on cultural monkey knowledge. So why not with humans, too? Why do genes need to be invoked at all, Jonathan? And if they're real, to what percent do they determine behavior? More than 5%? Haidt also discusses here in Part 3 how he believes happiness comes from both within and without, how, according to him, and contrary to the new atheists such as Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens, the alleged essence of religion is more than a supernatural belief system, and finally, how he came to understand the difference between religious orthodoxy and conservatism, saying he learned something important by reading Edmund Burke, Thomas Sowell, and Friedrich Hayek. Having completed an examination of his arguments about human moral nature, let's turn to evaluation. The good. First, he's right that people often make rationalizations for their behavior, trying to explain away their mistakes and faults so they can look good. But we all know this, and it often depends on A, the context in which this happens, whether among family and friends, with your psychotherapist if you've hit rock bottom in your addiction, or in public in full view of everyone. B, sometimes it's counterproductive to give your enemies knowledge about your faults. And C, regardless, we know that some people are a lot more open and honest than others, whatever percentage of the population they are. To imply that everyone is a liar, blind to their own mistakes, when some lie 5% of the time for perhaps justifiable reasons, and can be enormously self-aware, and others 50% of the time with no self-knowledge, is to misunderstand how many good, rational people exist. Secondly, it's true, as he says, that our conscious minds and their ideas are not necessarily right. Our intuitions might direct us better. A typical example here, ironically, would be with conscious hatred and dislike that many religions, such as Catholicism and Islam, have shown historically towards both human freedom and sexuality, their hatred being highly counterproductive to human happiness. Now the bad. The reality is that Haidt makes so many mistakes throughout that I'll just concentrate on the most egregious. Number one, if you want to understand morality, you need to understand the most moral people. Likewise for societies. And the most moral and productive human society in history was and is the West. And why is the West the best? Because of two basic reasons. A, it has historically been more capable of producing productive knowledge, and B, it has protected property rights more. Both of these variables reinforce each other. They go hand in hand. And why is a society that loves knowledge and freedom so moral and productive? Because it rewards or punishes the individual based on whether he individually is productive or not. It incentivizes him the most. The collective societies that Haidt praises do not. Haidt throughout is oblivious to these two essential drivers of moral society, in other words, of civilization itself. But if his theory were true, wouldn't this prove that the West genetically is morally superior? Number two, he complains that the West has been worshiping reason and distrusting the passions for thousands of years. But this is false, since the Renaissance and the Age of Romanticism celebrated passion and beauty in art, creating overall the greatest art and music in all of human history. Secondly, the reality is that the West has been so successful precisely because it has used reason so much in the form of scientific discovery and technological innovation to give untold benefits like antibiotics, cars, the telephone, airplane, and computers to all of humanity. That use of reason was highly moral. Additionally, in trying to understand the history of Western thought, he constantly fails to distinguish between Western thinkers who were rationalistic, like Plato, who was highly irrational in despising physical reality and the empirical sciences, and those who were rational, like Aristotle, who developed logic and did empirical science successfully. What an epic failure, Jonathan. So, for example, his statement that anyone who values truth should stop worshiping reason shows his profound ignorance. Number three, he wants to denigrate rational selfishness, egoism, but fails to understand that when we are rationally selfish, we help others, and thus it's win-win. There's no contradiction or paradox. A typical example would be Sam Walton, who created Walmart, a company employing millions of people who have given great value to billions of human beings, with Sam, as a result, becoming one of the richest men in the world. Haidt, ironically, since he spent his whole life studying morality, is oblivious, as Ayn Rand famously put it, to the virtue of selfishness, rational selfishness. Sam Walton was a highly moral person, Jonathan. Number four, Haidt makes another huge fundamental mistake in thinking that intuitions are not affected by ideas, but very often they are. They come second, not first. So here's an example. When I went to high school, a Muslim schoolmate thought that ham was disgusting. Smelling it made him nauseous, which I, understanding the culinary greatness of bacon, pork chops, and fine Italian ham, thought was comically and bizarrely irrational, which it was. But was this Muslim born that way, Jonathan? With his irrational distaste? No, he obviously incorporated those ideas into his psychology from his irrational family and friends. So his irrational feelings, his culinary intuitions, came after his Islamic indoctrination, not before. The same basic insight can apply to, in effect, every single intuition that a baby, child, or person can acquire. Do babies, for example, think that eating their dried nasal mucus, boogers, is bad? No, they happily munch away. Their feelings of disgust come after their families have told them it's bad. And the same understanding can be applied to hundreds of human moral feelings and so-called intuitions. In this sense, Rousseau is sometimes right. But Haidt, throughout the book, assumes that intuitions are somehow primary, that babies don't get intuitions because of the socialization process. This simple mistake destroys much of this entire theoretical edifice. Number 5. Similarly, Haidt fundamentally fails to grasp that the intuitions that people have are often the result of the societal ideologies that have been crammed or indoctrinated into them by the state, in which case it can't tell us anything about intrinsic moral nature, only the power of state indoctrination. So if, for example, so many young Chinese are indoctrinated in their schools with aggressive nationalism and hatred of the West in America, are their feelings the result of their intrinsic, genetic Chinese intuitions, Jonathan? Or instead a simple result of communist indoctrination? Likewise, if many Muslims throughout the world hate Jews, were their children born that way, Jonathan? No. Number 6, he claims again and again that morality binds and blinds. But the opposite is often true. When we love someone, we can instead be highly motivated to see them objectively so we can help them and ourselves be happy together. Morality, in this case, enlightens. It depends on the person. Number 7. Haidt defines religion as a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. Beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called a church. No, this completely fails. A religion intellectually is a self-deceptive belief system dealing with the supernatural. The supernatural part is essential, as is the self-deception, since there is no evidence for the supernatural. Additionally, there are many sacred things that have nothing to do with religion. The beaches of Normandy, for example, are sacred because our fathers and our forefathers who gave their lives there for our freedoms. But that sacredness has nothing to do in the slightest with the metaphysically impossible, the supernatural, the religious. Number 8, he says, if I have failed and you have a visceral dislike of intuitionism or of me, then no amount of evidence I could present will convince you that intuitionism is correct. But if you now feel an intuitive sense that intuitionism might be true, then let's keep going. This is absurd. I might have a profound dislike, whether visceral or otherwise, about him and or his theories because he's mistaken and promoting harmful moral ideas to everyone. Here he's implying that if we dislike his theories, we must be irrational. That's his own confirmation bias, an assumption of infallibility at work. Finally, number 9. He claims that libertarians have less compassion than liberals, implying perhaps that they're less moral. But this implication would be unproven, since it's quite possible that bleeding heart liberals have too much compassion and libertarians and classical liberals just the right amount. Given all these basic mistakes, I'd give this book a C- at best. Very happy for my part that we English threw off the yoke of the self-righteous Catholic Church long ago, and now just need to remove all those self-righteous Anglican divines. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.